session here on the stage. I think this session highlighted just how vital future-ready cryptography is as Saudi Arabia accelerates its position as a global digital leader. And the message is clear. Organizations can't afford to take a wait-and-see approach. By aligning with NCS now, strengthening crypto agility and preparing systems for the next era of cryptographic change, they can safeguard the data, services, and national platforms driving the kingdom's digital transformation. Okay, we are cruising towards the end of our program, but we still have some fantastic presentations taking place on this stage. So our next session, titled Old Wounds, Smarter Weapons, is all about. So, despite decades of security maturity, organizations continue to be compromised by the same long-standing flaws. And as AI accelerates vulnerability discovery, exploitation, and deception, the challenge is no longer about just identifying weaknesses. It's proving that we've actually eliminated the old vulnerabilities and can respond quickly and reliably to the new ones. So this session examines how to break that cycle for good and build real, measurable confidence in security at scale. And we have a great speaker delivering this for you. In fact, she is one of my favorite Black Hat speakers. So please give it up for Jaya Baloo, COO and CISO of ISLE.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I want to talk to you about how we still have to do old wounds while we deal with ever smarter weapons. It means that we need to rethink cyber defense. So whenever we talk about, hackers, that's where we usually start. I always like to say hackers will hack for fun, for profit, and for politics, and usually in that order. And we always knew this. This is how we would look at attribution, who was doing the attacks, how were they conducting it, and what we see is those lines are blurring. We saw it when we started having vigilantes recruited to actually do military operations as civilians in the field. They would do their 9-to-5 job, and then afterwards, they would be conducting offensive cyber activity. And then subsequently, we saw ransomware gangs, who used to be only in it for the profit, also have political, ideological beliefs, either supporting Russia or supporting Ukraine in a separate conflict. And then we saw the beginning of things like Conti leaks. And then we also see nation-state attackers who we always thought would only be hacking for espionage, also in it for profit. So, folks like Kim Jong, who've netted anywhere between $2 to $5 billion on ransomware operations, are now also interested in going after crypto exchanges. So this is incredibly dynamic and fluid and evolving as we watch. And it should worry us. Why are these folks still so successful with ransomware? And why is it that regardless of how much we spend on defense, we still estimate that ransomware is going to exceed $275 billion by 2031? That is an insane number. And you must ask yourself, do you have an equivalent and commensurate amount of protections? And the reason that these gangs are so successful, of course, is because they are not operating as incredibly diligent, highly technical engineers. Not only, the reason that they're so successful is because of their affiliate structure. They're able to take a few smart engineers and then expand their scope and scale and reach in order to infect all of these people and generate all of that funding. So I used to be the CISO of Rapid7, and in 2023, we had a report where we talked about why are these attacks so successful? Why does Red Team always win? And what we saw was that in the initial access vectors in 2023, the reason that these attackers were so successful were things like valid accounts, so credential reuse without multi-factor authentication. That was 38%. The other 35% was just vulnerability exploitation, so known vulnerabilities that were not patched in time and subsequently gave the attacker an attack surface to actually penetrate the entity. Look at the change in 2025. In fact, there is no change. So we saw in the Verizon data breach report in 2025, we were still seeing the biggest reasons why attackers are successful still being credential abuse and exploitation of vulnerabilities. You know, it seems like we are not sufficiently learning at scale with these old wounds. We know they're old wounds because they've been existing for so long, how to actually defeat this. If you think about the Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 rule, if we spent 20% of our budget on two problems, just on identity and vulnerabilities, we'd be able to solve 80% of the attack surface. That's the Pareto principle in working. So this is how we need to rethink what we actually work on. And attackers know this. We see this in terms of cyber war. If you look at the type of exploitation they've needed to do, they needed to lay the groundwork for these types of attacks over years. So they need to connect the credential space with different attack techniques. So we saw that with Stuxnet, where you had Qmint, SIGINT, all different types of intelligence gathering and multiple 0 days involved in order to run this operation. We saw the same with Black Energy, where you had an initial attack on the critical infrastructure of Ukraine before you actually saw any type of physical invasion. And we saw this also with the Typhoon-class attacks on US telecommunications infrastructure originating from China. Now we're already at the next iteration, so we have Volt, Flax, Salt, and Silk Typhoon, all compromising telecoms in the US in order to get their target. So I think we need to think about our own long game. If the cyber attackers have been planning their attack for years, why are we still doing annual plans for our budgets when it comes to how we defend against these attacks? We need to think multi-year in order to actually be able to defend. And one of the reasons I want to tell you why we need to do that is because our supply chains are under pressure. We have the proof to prove it. Everything from the Lebanese pager attacks to Progress, the SolarWinds attack, but even things that defenders rely on every day, like the National Vulnerability Database, where we have a collection of all of our vulnerability information. This is the reason that we now have an EU vulnerability database, because the EU does not want to be at the mercy of the United States in order to get the right information about which vulnerabilities should I focus on. And finally, because of the Trump administration's ability to stop Microsoft and other connectivity services to the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, all of the EU is looking for alternatives to Microsoft, Amazon, etc. This nationalism, this sovereignty, this move doesn't mean that you're necessarily always going to get better security. Countries like Germany are exploring completely open source alternatives to using Microsoft Cloud. Think about what this means when you see the ripple effect across the planet. Look, and we've seen this, right? I'm sure you've heard ad nauseum about the F5 supply chain attack, which created a breach for multiple networks. The attackers were in F5 for more than a year. They exfiltrated all of the source code. So we're going to be hearing about this one for a very long time. And F5 is like one of the biggest companies in cybersecurity. So, their spread is across the planet. I'm also not going to explain ad nauseum the NPM hack. And we've also seen multiple variations of this and incredible amounts of attack surface being done with Shai Hulud. And we're not even seeing the first version. 6 days ago, we also saw the second version of a package manager attack. And we're talking about tons of packages, lots of repos, lots of software affected. So we really need to think in terms of how do we do this at scale. And this is where AI enters the fray. Last year, on the Black Hat executive stage, I spoke to the CISO of Arab. We thought that the biggest threat from AI for cybersecurity that we were all freaking out about was deepfakes. Do you guys remember that? Deepfakes, that's what we talked to you about last year at Black Hat. And we were talking about things like, oh no, what about things like OnlyFake, where you can generate false identities in order to open up bank accounts, because banks don't necessarily have the protection against things like OnlyFakes. What we're seeing is it's actually much more insidious. We're talking about looking for vulnerabilities. You might be familiar with the robot operating system. It's used for having the capacity to automate industrial robots at scale, but also like packaging robots, automotive robots, et cetera. They all use RAWs, either version 1 or version 2. And what we saw was, in April of this year, there were vulnerabilities found on the Unitree robots. You know the little dogs that you see at the conferences that walk around? There was a back door on the Unitree robot, which allowed you to just enter the robot, and it has an onboard camera. You could do with it what you wanted. If you guys remember the Black Mirror episode, that's scary, right? Everybody agrees that's kind of terrifying when the robot opens the door, it comes into your house and kills everyone. Bad movie. But what's really terrifying is this exploit. In August, Unitree lost their encryption keys. Kind of bad. But then, if you took those encryption keys and you encrypted the word Unitree and you sent it to the humanoid robot, you are now root on the humanoid robot. Now, just a show of hands, how many of you think that is good security practice? Okay, good. Either you're very tired and don't feel like raising your hand, or you all agree with me. I'm going to believe the latter. The clue is that this is clearly a really terrible security practice. And unfortunately, not only backdooring one robot, but because this communicates over Bluetooth Low Energy, you can scan for other robots in the vicinity and then root them as well. So you now have your own little robot fleet to do with what you will. This is a concern because this is what we think of. We think of robotics when we think of AI threats. We think of deepfakes, but actually it's much worse. So if you know the DARPA Grand Challenge, it happened over 10 years ago, is the ability to do both attack and defense using AI. We used to think that the only real AI attacks that we ever saw were domain-generating algorithms, where you could spin up domains faster than defenders could block them. However, we know that that's evolved. So the DARPA AI Cyber Challenge shows us this evolution because what they did is they injected vulnerabilities into open source repositories, and subsequently during the AICC, the competitors found over 61% of them. They also found not just the injected vulnerabilities, the synthetic ones, they also found real vulnerabilities that were not introduced by the creators of the Cyber Challenge. That is really interesting. Finding new vulnerabilities, true positives that were not previously discovered, that's interesting. And then they were also able to patch those bugs that they found in an average of 45 minutes. That's interesting. So if we take a look at this, right, finding bugs, finding new weapons, new 0 days, let's take a look at actually what we think about in terms of looking at it in the wild versus looking at it from an end user perspective. And you see still that we have a ton of end user vulnerabilities, 42 vulnerabilities versus 33 that are targeting enterprises. So it's not a lot of 0 days because still the majority of them are still targeting just the regular people. And then if you look at a rate of growth from 0 day versus all known exploitable vulnerabilities, you see that the 0 day generic known exploitabilities rate is much higher than the regular known exploited vulnerabilities. So we have a lot of 0 days coming out there, and we have an increasing time or a decreasing vector in terms of how long it takes us to actually exploit those vulnerabilities. That time is getting less and less. What's really cool, and if you've seen that, is Google's Big Sleep project, where they worked with Google Threat Intelligence and DeepMind to find a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. They found probably hundreds, but they've reported several CVEs to maintainers in order to actually figure out how to actually fix these things. So let's talk about the fact that this is still a money-making machine, because if you have a 0 day, for example, for an iOS platform, it's still roughly $20 million. And if you look at who's buying these vulnerabilities, it's still the usual suspects. So the majority of these are still nation states, and then you have a whole bunch of commercial surveillance vendors. Hey guys, that's also the ransomware gangs. They've made enough money to be able to buy 0 days from other people in order to continue making more money with ransomware. Yeah? It's a cycle that is not going to stop unless we figure out a better way to deal with this problem. So this is a really significant thing, but I want to still introduce a really check because that scale has shifted. We used to be thinking about the fact that it used to take a couple of months when we would see a patch to reverse engineer the patch, figure out what that is, have POC code, and then get to a new exploit. That used to take a very long time. But with something like CVE Genie, we can now generate working exploits By the way, not perfectly, because you see this image that forgot the I in the word exploit. This is an AI-generated image. So it forgets the I, but it can still generate exploits in 15 minutes and with a token cost of $2.77. I want to ask you something. If we can generate an exploit for a vulnerability in 15 minutes at $2.77, how much does it cost you to fix a single vulnerability? Think about what it costs you. Think about the amount of Jira tickets, okay? The Slack messages. Yeah, it's insane. These economics make no sense. So this is why we need to rethink how we do this. And another big whammy, which I don't think should surprise you, all of the current tools that we have is based on static detections, signature basis for understanding what the attackers are doing, how we actually look at malware. It's signature based, the majority of it is. So what do we do with something that evolves even slightly? So look, I don't want to alarm you, I'm not saying that this is prevalent. I just think we need to be aware and prepare now. Think of the long game in order to think of what is the evolution of evading the current security stack that we have already deployed across our networks and systems to actually catch these types of attacks. That needs to change. So I also want you to think about one more factor before you run out, buy all the AIs and implement everything. I want you to think of the AI that you put in your network as an additional insider threat vector, predominantly because of things like AI agentic misalignment. You want something, the AI might not share your goals. If you read the August Anthropic report, you'll read all about this, where you saw that, Claude was trying to blackmail the researcher when the researcher tried to turn it off. The AI wants to attack not autonomously against whatever interest you may have. So there's a whole bunch of threats. Feel free to take a photo, but I really want you to think about what are the insider threat vectors that AI can pose for your organization when you deploy it and when you don't have the right safeguards. So what are the safeguards that I want you to deploy? I want you to think about this. Again, new technology, but with a lot of the old vulnerability and attack space that we always used to see. So I want you to think about, how do we isolate it? How do we monitor it correctly? So zero trust, again, for this AI, especially when you're doing agents and MCP servers, et cetera. I want you to test and test again. Sanity check it, predictive behavior. Make sure that you understand what the benchmarks for that are and have scalable oversight to actually follow through. Do input sanitization. There are companies here that are represented that will happily help you with that kind of stuff, and have institutional controls that you continuously reevaluate. It's not a never done thing as long as you're implementing new technologies, okay? One thing should be clear from everything I'm telling you, which is that it's a dual-used, dual-edged sword. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. Right now, the advantage is for the attacker. You, the defender, do not have enough of these tools. The attacker doesn't have to go through procurement or check with legal or check with some audit team before they can deploy whatever. You do. So make sure that you have the same tooling with the defenders. This is one of the biggest reasons I left my job as CISO as Rapid7 in order to do a startup that actually looks at things like this, because I thought either I'm going to complain about the problem or I'm going to do something about it. So this is actually what we're doing. I want to help fix the things, but before we fix it, we're also finding. So we found a bunch of 0 days. We found 3 out of the 4 vulnerabilities in OpenSSL. We found, a CVSS 10 vulnerability in Samba. I don't know if you use Samba, but question your life choices when you do. And we found a bunch of other vulnerabilities, including in NASA's crypto library that powers a spacecraft. If we can do this, and I just want to make a point, like, we implemented our scanner to find these vulnerabilities in July. We're now in December. In July, we implemented the scanner. We have found over 200 vulnerabilities, and we have over 40 CVEs. If we can do it, so can a nation state, so can another attacker. My team is only 40 people. 40 people found 200 bugs using LLMs. So I really think we need to rethink how we do both vulnerability detection, because the other scanners never found it, and how we do vulnerability remediation, because the goal is to fix it with that long-term view so that we can all be safe while we implement the future of robotics, while we have space missions, et cetera, et cetera. While we have more AI, we need to have better defenses. So I want you to focus, use the Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, focus on identity first. Identity for everything, especially in the age of AI. The identity that you have around the agents, we're going from pass the hash to pass the OAuth token. Okay, that's the only shift, really. It's still an identity problem. So please, please, think about multi-factor authentication, use YubiKeys. Then think about, because we know that's the biggest surface area for attack, do that first, then think about vulnerability management, specifically patch management, and then when you have time left, do phishing. That's where your money should be going, on those 3 problems. Then look at those things that are important before they become urgent, like AI and quantum. And remember that everything that you learned is not worthless just because we're using AI. It's still about defense in depth. It's still about assuming that something will break and you have a plan B. So I want you to think about the fact that innovation in cybersecurity is everything right now. So go get out there and innovate your butts off. So enjoy. I'm sorry I had to go really fast. I tried to give a lot of information in 20 minutes, but if you have any questions, or if you ever want to chit-chat, I'm happy to do that. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody.